Hi, everybody. Welcome to Project Unicorn and SIIA Education's Beyond Checking an RFP Box, a webinar for EdTech vendors. My name is Erin Moat. I'm the Executive Director of Innovate EDU, and I'm going to be your host for today. While we're letting folks into the webinar, do me a favor and introduce yourself in the chat so we know who's here. We'll get started in just about a minute. Thanks, everybody. As you're entering our webinar, if you would take a second and introduce yourself in the chat, we'd love to know who's here. It's great to see some familiar names. It's great to see some new folks joining us today. We're super pleased to welcome you. And I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to Beyond Checking an RFP Box, a webinar for EdTech vendors. We're so excited to have you today. This will be an opportunity to hear from our esteemed group of panelists, but also for you to ask some questions. So let's get started. I just want to take a moment to thank our friends and partners at SIIA for their longtime partnership in Project Unicorn, but specifically in this webinar, and really helping us think about how can Project Unicorn serve the EdTech vendor community. If you have ideas about what we could be doing in terms of programming or other interests that you might have, please don't hesitate to drop those in the chat today. We're always looking for ways to partner and to really add something to the conversation for our partners who are EdTech vendors. Well, we have a blessing of unicorns. Don't know if you know this, but if you walk away with any piece of trivia from today's webinar, you know that a group of unicorns is called a blessing. And wow, do we have a blessing today. Our panelists are going to introduce themselves later on, but Philip, John, Rose, and Sarah, so grateful to have you on this panel today and to welcome you to this conversation. So it's really important to manage expectations. And so I want to make sure that everyone on the webinar knows that this is not going to be a technical deep dive today into standards or how to understand the latest in standards news. If you want to do that, there will be a series of webinars that are being released by our technical advisory committee over the spring, as well as sign up for the Project Unicorn newsletter where standards updates and the latest breaking news on the technical documentation and what's happening with the standards bodies is often included. But today, what this is an overview of interoperability implementation and sales for EdTech vendors and developers. So we want to be able to help answer some very basic questions about how do you answer questions your customers might have about interoperability. And also to share with you some of the things that are going to be happening in different member communities over the spring that are going to have you having customers ask these questions more and more frequently. So we're going to take a brief moment today to talk about interoperability, level set on what it is and why you're being asked these questions. We're going to give a very brief overview of some of the changing landscape for data standards for schools. We're going to talk through some resources, toolkits, and checklists. You're going to see those come into the chat, and we'll be sharing resources throughout the webinar. And then finally, after our panelists answer a couple of pre-prepared questions, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. Go ahead and put those in throughout the chat as those questions come up, and we'll try to get to those. So today, we really want you to be able to walk away knowing what questions your customers are going to be asked, knowing how to ask your developers those questions and how to get the right answers, understanding what a checklist for a standard certification in a request for proposal might look like. And then finally, we're going to briefly touch a little bit on the procurement process and where you're probably going to be asked these questions. So What is interoperability, and why are you all of a sudden being asked about interoperability standards in RFPs? Well, there's a very good set of answers for those questions. So we define interoperability at Project Unicorn as the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. At Project Unicorn, we know that there are many different standards in the K-12 education space, and so we are supportive of standard-aligned adoption. And who does interoperability help? Well, it helps everyone in the EdTech ecosystem. So you're going to see state teams asking you about interoperability. You're going to see district teams asking you about that. You might even see teachers start asking you questions when they're signing up for applications about interoperability or the ability to get data out of their system or data into the system. Finally, while students and families might not ask you about data interoperability, they are going to want to know how their data is being shared, exchanged, and also that it's happening in a private and secure way. We hope that you are really thinking about interoperability in terms of meeting the market where it is and how to stay ahead of the market, supporting students and teachers with easily transferable, secure data. And ultimately, we hope that you will increase your sales by offering something that districts and states are increasingly demanding. So what's the data standards landscape for schools? And this is something I could talk about for hours. So I'm hoping to just give you some late breaking news in terms of where we see districts and schools thinking about interoperability. So we believe that there's been a huge rise, and we'll show you some data on the next slide, in states, districts, and CMOs, charter management organizations, increasingly prioritizing data interoperability in education. We think that this will continue to be compounded by the influx of ed software that's being used, particularly during the pandemic, in remote learning. We also see states and LEAs increasingly moving to the cloud and increasingly looking at SaaS products as well as cloud storage products. And frankly, because many of them are having to toggle between remote and in-person learning, this movement to the cloud, we believe, will be vastly accelerated. We are seeing, again, data infrastructure being something that states, schools, and districts are starting to ask for. But there's some complexity there. There's some challenges in terms of IT sophistication and capacity of our folks in the districts to understand complex enterprise architecture. But it's also sometimes expensive at the beginning to make this move from CapEx to OpEx in terms of a cloud switch. We, though, anticipate that about 20 to 40% of LEAs and SIIAs will be at some stage of transitioning their infrastructure to the cloud over the next 3 years. And they're doing that in order to drive greater data interoperability. Let's see what our partners at COSIN are saying. So at COSIN, annually, they survey sort of what are CTOs saying, CIO, CTO saying about the need for interoperability. And you can see that they are really saying that interoperability will help them meet their reporting and compliance requirements, that over half of them are now saying they think about interoperability in their purchasing decisions. And then there's a lot of other support there for the fact that COVID is vastly accelerating the change in what data infrastructure looks like and what the expectations are in terms of what school districts are expecting from you, their EdTech vendors and providers. So how do you meet this demand, and how do you skill up, if you will, besides attending this webinar? What are some tools, resources, checklists that are out there so that you can be aware of what's happening? The first one I want to point out is this is what your customers are reading, so you should read it too. COSIN has released some RFP guidance on interoperability, procurement, and requirements. And you'll see that popping up right now. Folks are using this to write their RFPs right now. And so they're looking for these main 6 tenants, and COSIN's done a really good job of creating live documentation so you can see what's going on. Customers are also looking at our RFP and contract library, where there's an extensive set of resources with model contracts, model agreements, so on and so forth. These are the tools and templates that schools and districts are using in order to put out procurements for your services. And then coming soon, you're going to see 2 of our great partners within the Project Unicorn family release some new work. One is a procurement and guidance toolkit from the Council of Great City Schools, and the other is from our friends at EdSurge and ISTE, which is a revamp of their product index, including indicators around interoperability and privacy. We know that this is where your customers are going to go to get information, and so please, as these tools are being released, familiarize yourself with these toolkits. Understand and make sure that your information is accurate in your product indexes, because this is where your customers go to find the information about EdTech tools in their space. So I get to stop talking now and turn it over to a really exciting group, a blessing, as I shared, of panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, just going straight across the slide. So Philip, why don't you kick us off?
Hey everybody, thank you Erin for the introduction. My name is Philip Hymas. I work for Innovation Natives and Power School, currently residing in Germany and exploring the EdTech scene here in Europe.
John, you want to go next?
Yes. I'm Rob. I work for the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. I am a product manager, and our team works on the EdFi integration, the data interoperability project statewide.
Hi, Erin. Hi, fellow unicorns. I've never heard the term a blessing. I'm humbled. Thanks for including us. I'm president of Education Solutions, which is all of the products and services that face the pre-K-12 education sector at Scholastic Inc.
Great. And Sarah, bring us home.
I am education policy at SIIA, and I work on all things education policy, which these days includes interoperability. So thanks for having me, and it's good to see so many familiar names in attendance.
Great. Well, let's kick off and get to our next question. So John, you manage a statewide interoperability project in the great state of Wisconsin. What's the lesson that you've learned from this work that's applicable to the audience that's on the call today?
Sure. Thanks, Erin. So just to give everybody context, in Wisconsin, we have about 854,000 public school students, 421 districts. And at this time, we have 29 vendors that we integrate with in our data pipeline. And 21 of those are student information system vendors. And it's our 6th year of implementation. So I just wanted to set that context. Our pipeline collects required state and federal data, and we have a lot of value add services that we're providing back to districts now too, to give them data back. So as far as lessons, I mean, the one thing that the vendors and the state always have to remember is we have to remember who we're working for. We're working for the students, and we're working for the educational agencies, so that we can provide the data they need to improve student planning or student improvement planning, potentially policy change, as well as funding to get where it's needed. And the data timeliness is critical, and you gain a huge advantage with interoperable solutions for data timeliness, which in the past wasn't always the case. Data might lag up to a year or more. We've learned to focus on use case based integration specifications for our vendors. So when we give a vendor a specification and say, hey, we're going to start collecting this data through our pipeline, we want to give them something that is kind of real world language. It helps the analysts, it helps the developers, and it helps to have a little better success. And we try to get those specifications out early to the vendors, kind of in a December to February timeframe prior to the next school year. Having constant communication with the vendors is critical, but we do it collaboratively with the districts too. So we have LEA advisors, district advisors, our team. We have a vendor meeting specific for each major vendor, and we work through issues, float new ideas, concepts, and it helps guide our prioritization as much as possible. And then I think a couple other lessons, stick as close to the standards, the core of the standards as we can, because that benefits the vendors and it benefits the community. And in our case, we're using the EdFi standard. And sometimes we have to extend the standard a bit, but we do everything we can to keep the core. And then finally, we push the vendors to try to improve their data quality checks upstream. This is a pipeline, right? So if you can get the data quality high before it even enters the pipeline, so at the student information system at the district, it reduces the chance that the district is going to have to get the data quality results from us and go back to the source system and fix it. So good error reporting on the vendor side, and then just really good error reporting back to the district, so somebody that's a non-tech user can understand it. So those are probably some of our top items to share in that regard. There are others, but those are probably some of the bigger ones.
Communication, whether that's communication about errors, communication about requirements, but really having communication with the EdTech vendor and with your customers is the way that you all have been successful in Wisconsin. So talking to each other, actually what interoperability is all about, right? Talking to each other. For my next question, I want to turn to Rose, Sarah, and Philip. When we are talking to each other at a vendor, how do we start the conversation between the engineering and the sales teams, which sometimes are a little bit disjunct and might have different ideas about timelines or feature sets, so on and so forth. So I'm going to kick it off with Sarah, and then I'll turn to you, Philip and Rose. Sarah.
I think coming from, I work with a lot of vendors and get a lot of questions from vendors of just, can you give me the lay of the land of what's going on? I think I know two of the first things that I send to our members and folks that ask me these questions are the Project Unicorn resources. One being the first, and I think they will magically pop up on your screen. One being first 3 steps for EdTech sales reps, and first 3 steps for software architects. We worked with Project Unicorn to put those together. And I think that they can be super useful for your team and teams to understand how to talk to each other as you are moving forward. Because the first likely call you're going to get if you haven't been dealing with interoperability is from a salesperson or a legal person saying, hey, we have to do this interoperability thing now. Where are we? What's going on? And why haven't we been doing it already? We're going to lose out on this contract.
Dad.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think the engineering team and the sales team have to be very close. I think sometimes it's in many companies, it's very siloed. I think they need to talk a lot where the products are, so the sales team doesn't oversell or undersell. And be very mindful of, especially with PowerSchool, where we have a whole suite of products. We want to make sure that not only do we, satisfy the interoperability portion of the contract, but also the timelines. So if we start on a different version of an API, we want to keep the sales team informed on the cadence and the status of said API. And when that is ready to be rolled out, so that everybody communicates well and the customer is not getting disappointed or we don't reach a certain milestone. So I think that communication needs to happen on a regular basis. And at PowerSchool, this happens almost on a daily basis.
Rose, you and I actually met because of a conversation where you called me up and you said, what's going on here with this procurement requirement? You want to talk a little bit about this, but also how do you start that conversation between the engineering and sales team?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sarah put it very well. The first time you really start taking this seriously is when there's a PO sitting on the table. And that is the worst possible time to, I think, deal with it, because it's totally reactive. It's not connected to the roadmap. And anybody who has to do anything additional starts resenting the work, the meeting, and the sudden emergency. So I think just generally there needs to be a mindset, which is I think what's great about the work Unicorn's doing around understanding what your roadmap is, and that interoperability is not something that you need to completely connect to one PO here and one sale there or one state here. As you said earlier, and as we're going to see as a result of COVID, it's going to continue to happen. If it's not happening at the child level, it's happening at the teacher level, and we're going to start to see a lot more happening, I think, with a push from the public, with so many parents having and families aware of what it really means to have such a fragmented ecosystem. So I think the key thing I would say is, whether it's daily or weekly or whatever the cadence of work is, and generally it's really product management sitting in between engineering and sales that should be managing this by taking the inputs from the field, from customers, and from the standards bodies, and building them proactively into a roadmap. And then, as I think one of you said, being very explicit about what you do support when and for whom. I know we're going to get on to a little bit of the differences here. I know there may be people on the call who think, well, we have a relationship with Clever, or we're already doing this. It's much bigger than a single relationship. So I think understanding the ecosystem more broadly and the kinds of tools that you all are putting out will help product management teams socialize that both outwardly to sales reps to ask the right questions, and then to engineering folks who may not be familiar with the kind of standards we talk about in the EdTech space specifically, and the use cases around data integration and data interoperability.
Super helpful. So as we are sort of thinking about not just communication within the EdTech vendor, but the communication that you have, the fit that you have with a district. This is something John mentioned a bit when he was talking about the types of things that he's learned in implementation. Sarah, I'm going to have you kick us off again, but how should vendors think about fit with a school district or a customer? And what's the sort of conversation that needs to happen there to begin?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest thing is you want to make sure that you don't have just a one-year contract. You want to make sure that this is a long-term relationship. So if you get if your sales team is ready to finalize a sale with a school district and it does not align at all to what your technological capabilities are, you should think about, does this make sense? Will we have a fit going forward? Will we be able to continue on with this contract? Because it'll be a lot of bootstrapping and band-aiding things together if you aren't thinking about this relationship as a long-term relationship. So I think be cautious, and if you think that you're able to provide them the tech that they need, not just the technological solution to provide spelling tests, but also the technological solutions to tie into the tools that need to be tied together, and making sure that long-term relationship is a good one. That's the direction that you should think about going in.
Sorry, I think you said me. So, I mean, this is a luxury question because I think most vendors on the call, feel like they're not really in a position to be choosing their customers. I think sometimes there's definitely a benefit in thinking, are we a good match as a set of partners? But on the whole, I can't think of an AE, an account executive that I worked with in my 25 years who thinks quite like that. They might have preferred districts and schools to work with, but all customers can be good customers. I think explicitness around the offering, which has been touched on, and is really important. And what capabilities you do have today. And again, back to my roadmap point, what is on the roadmap and when it's coming. Districts can tolerate change if you are explicit and trustworthy. And so I think that's important, and why you need an outward-facing roadmap, even if it's, it doesn't go, many years out, which if you're agile, it shouldn't. So I think that's another. I think, we've all been in situations, I think many vendors would agree, where you've had to do something unique in a school district context. So as well as what Sarah said around, is this a multi-year partnership? I think, is this also, reproducible work? If you're integrating with a particular system, is that a system that is widely penetrated elsewhere? Most importantly, is it standards-based, whichever standards framework you're integrating, you're implementing? And so, if you're doing individual rework, this is not a great model going forward for the ecosystem. So trying to look at the opportunities you have. If this isn't a capability and you really want to work with this partner and customer, is this something you're going to be able to use elsewhere, and how to think about that strategic roadmap pivot that might be necessary in a more holistic business sense.
Philip.
Yeah, I think an honest conversation and going back to communication is very important, so that we communicate as a vendor to the district what we need from them in order to make this project a successful project. I think to evaluate the stress we may put on the IT department is very important, to discuss this openly, that we communicate well as vendors what is required of the IT department for a business analyst to go in to do the data discovery, and then also be very mindful of the roadmap, so the cadence is not too rapid, to be a little bit forgiving with some milestones. What we've seen often is, we have dependencies. As a vendor, I can only move as fast as the BA gives me the answers to a rules engine question if I have to calibrate that API. And again, having a good project manager and a good kickoff with all stakeholders on board to discuss the lift and the level of effort and what everybody has to bring to the table. Then it is a successful fit, but it has to be a very candid conversation up front and not to sugarcoat things. So I'm always a big fan of talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. When it comes to data interoperability, it's always worth the strain, but definitely make sure that the resources are available on the school side, especially now, right, where with COVID-19, LEAs and SIIAs are spread thin, that we have this open communication and also assess risks and talk about mitigations during these kickoff meetings. I think that is very important.
Yeah, I really appreciate your comments there, Philip, about radical candor. Like, I think, there's a really important piece of trust and looking at these relationships as partnerships. And I've never met a CTO, CIO who doesn't appreciate some level of radical candor. They want to know also what they're getting into, and do they have the right resources in order to be able to implement your solution. In the spirit of radical candor, Philip, people are using the word integration and interoperability pretty interchangeably. What's the difference?
Yeah, I mean, the way to look at it, integration can mean everything, right? So we have our SIS talk to assessment, or we pull data from various sources into the ODS, and we use a tapestry or an educational quilt made out of certain, various ETL engines or Python scripts, and in the end, they kind of all talk to one another, but that's not interoperability. Interoperability means that the data can talk to one another, and that is a very big difference between just systems and data. And we achieve that by placing APIs and building products with the goal of interoperability. I think in product development, we really have to start talking more about output and building in these API clients so they can talk to REST APIs. But the system integration, that's where LEAs sometimes can get confused. In the end, I can populate an ODS or a database with any kind of data. But a true interoperability implementation means that all systems can share data without any transformation whatsoever. And that's where data standards come into play, where EdFi shines, and then other data standards. And that is true interoperability, not this tapestry or quilt of various engines feeding source systems, or source systems feeding downstream data warehouses.
But let's not have, good be the enemy of perfect. And integration is on the road in many cases to interoperability. So, encouraging better and more proactive approaches that are standards-based on the integration side roads into the big highway of interoperability, I think is, certainly where some of our customers are, and some of the players are, and some are parts of the ecosystem.
I would agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that there are ways that it can be actually a pathway to transformation for companies. But I think when we think about where we want to ultimately be, right, I would love as a mom not to have a piece of paper on my fridge with 20 passwords for my son, Robert, who's in kindergarten. We'll talk about that later. But the challenge, I think, of just making the steps and understanding that this is a multi-year, multi-layered journey, I think is a really important piece of the work. John, I want to bring you back into the conversation. I know that you are using EdFi in Wisconsin, and EdFi has, different versions, right? Different standards have different versions. How do you ensure that a vendor is on the right version? What's the either language you use, or how do you have that conversation with a vendor?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have an annual process that we do that we have to kind of certify, if you want to call it that, with all of our vendors that we integrate with. So, for example, when we went from version 2 of EdFi to version 3, talk about a big lift for the vendors, the SIIAs, everybody. That was tough because there were breaking changes in there. So that was something where we, again, communication, we spoke to the vendors early and often and said, this is coming. And we got the use cases documented, and then they had to go through the integration testing. So we verify everybody each year. Now this year, for example, the changes there aren't breaking changes, but there are some new collections, some new data properties that we're going to ask the vendors to send to the state. And in the spirit of making sure that everybody is on the same page with use cases, we do go through that with the vendors that it's applicable to. So that's our process. And we have a vendor manager dedicated to managing all of the vendor relationships and the integration testing, because if you try to do that as a product manager or a business analyst, you get distracted from doing the other jobs you're supposed to be doing. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things I hear from districts as well is, well, I said, are you IMS compliant? I forgot, I didn't ask if you were IMS certified. Language matters, right? Is what you're saying here, and being precise in that language is really, really important.
Correct.
Thanks for sharing. So I'd love to sort of bring us home. We have some questions in the chat. So quickly, I'd love all the panelists to chime in on our next question, which is, we've talked a lot about places where folks have learned lessons or made mistakes, but what's an example of a practice where a vendor and a district, or just a vendor, is doing it right? And Rose, we'll start with you. Who's doing it right? Oh, Rose, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. I can only talk about the perspective of the work that we're doing. But I do think you do see, and having John on the call, shows how that works. That there are places, there are states where you see, while the district practices might be different, there is real state leadership going on, and so there's an understanding of where people want to move to from a roadmap perspective. I will say a place where I think we've seen that is in the last year or so is Texas, partly because of sort of some mass instructional adoption work that they're doing there, and most recently we've had a very large adoption in of supplemental kinds of EdTech materials in Cypress Fairbanks, and they brought a very coherent set of needs and plans that we were able to work together very collaboratively with them to ensure that they were thinking about integration more broadly than just us, plus their system of record. And there's a question from Brendan here, which I think is a good one, around, well, what about vendors working together, not just what's in the system? And so really listening as a vendor to who the other partners are and what other kinds of, to use Philip's metaphor, what other kinds of folks are in the tapestry, the quilt that's being used, because you are part of an ecosystem wherever you're going in. And while you'd like to be in control of everything there, that's not necessarily what you have or what they want. So I think it really is understanding how you fit in, particularly, asking those questions. And then one other thing that I didn't mention earlier in terms of great practices, which is what happened in this conversation, and Philip touched on this as well, which is making sure that you really have content, curriculum, and technology people in those conversations. Just like we're saying, it's not the job of legal and it's not the job of the engineers purely to work out these problems. Likewise, customer to customer, curriculum people don't always, in districts or states, and John could probably tell us some stories, talk to one another or talk across their own silos around how to put forward a roadmap that's both about the learning and about the data working together. So I do think that was a practice and a really good kickoff meeting that ensured that we and Cypress Fairbanks did a great job.
Philip?
I think recently we worked on an interoperability implementation in Florida, and communication is key. And what happened there, which I really liked, was that the client at the time wasn't quite sure how they wanted to go about the implementation, and they had some additional thoughts after the kickoff of the project. And I think it is really important for vendors to sometimes to be a little flexible, to look at the scope of work and look at it and crosswalk that against the potential extra effort. And if that is not dramatic, then I think you can be flexible and make a little pivot. And in Florida's case, we had a very good meeting with all stakeholders, and they wanted to go to a slightly different direction, and we made it happen. And that was really due to good project management, but also open channels. So for me, the Florida project was a very great example of how vendors and LEAs were partners and not just the buyer and the seller. It was a partnership working together to achieve interoperability.
Erin, can I just add in one other thing that Philip sparked for me is the crosswalk between, you know, the original vision and then what's needed, I think is a really important one. One of the ways that I've had teams manage this in the past is to look at a capacity model on the engineering and product management UX side that allows for more flexibility, particularly as you know are looking at this period really in the year, the spring through back to school, as new applications and learning experiences are coming online, and making sure that there is some excess capacity, and you're taking some things off the roadmap that might be sort of, you know, standard features to ensure that you have got some capacity to understand what's additional there. It's more of an internal process point for teams and vendors, but it really helps when when unexpected and rather strategic interoperable or integration projects come up, and they do come up every single time, and they're only going to come up more. So thinking about the capacity model differently, it's a little bit like the move from the cloud and how you think about CapEx and OpEx.
That's a great point. John, new rule for you. You can't tell us a vendor or a district in Wisconsin. So go outside of Wisconsin. Who's doing it right?
Well, I can speak more generically.
How about that? You don't want to give any other state any love.
No. So I can say that vendors that have done it right, they provide great training to the districts. I mean, that sounds obvious, right? But all the vendors that we're dealing with, you know, 29 implementations, we've seen some that just toss this over the wall. And what I'm talking about is the integration piece, the interoperability piece, I should say, to separate those terms. How to flip the switch to turn the interoperability on, if there's data mappings that have to be done, etc. The vendors that have done it well have made sure there is no gray in that area. They provide great support for the LEAs ongoing throughout the year. Great upfront data quality checks prior to sending the data. I mentioned that earlier. And they embrace interoperability. They don't treat it as if it's a thorn in their side. They have a good vision for it. They are looking at, if they're not there, building an architecture, knowing that the implementations they do in different states, or different districts, could have a little variation. So they're building that architecture so it's not so hard to pivot a little bit when you need to. So those are the vendors that I've seen that are succeeding the best in the interoperability world.
Sarah, what would you add?
Things that companies are doing and districts are doing. Power School and Scholastic are obviously great examples of companies that are thinking about it and also have the capacity to implement and do things. But I want to give a little shout out to the smaller or newer companies that are just sort of coming on board into the interoperability world, that have open ears and open minds and have provided their emails to various organizations to get more information, because that's really a good first step on the path. Project Unicorn or SIIA are great places to come to get more information on how you can move along your path to become more like Power School and Scholastic and other beacons like those. But just starting is an example of somebody doing it right.
Awesome. And then finally, for all of our panelists, it wouldn't be 2020 or 2021 if I didn't talk about the massive shift that COVID is going to bring to our industry. It's such going to be an accelerant for change, I believe, within not just education, but sort of wider society. Talk to me about how COVID will particularly shift the relationship between buyers and suppliers. Philip, you're on camera first, so you get to take this one.
Yeah, no, I think I think we at Power School are a lot more flexible. I think we see the pain LEAs are in, and SIIAs as well, and I think there's an opportunity here to be not too draconian on the SOW. So if we have some dependencies when it comes to getting feedback from the business analysts from the IT department, and we know that they're currently, the IT department at the LEA is underwater because they're rebooting the LMS or they have to populate student accounts. I think it definitely changed the tone, and for the better. I think if something to be learned from this COVID-19 year, or second year potentially, is communication, kinder communication, and then maybe more flexibility is needed and is doable. I mean, we've seen that we can do it, and I hope that other vendors will feel the same.
Yes, next. Sarah?
It's a tough question. Things that are going to change, but I think one of the things that I'm already seeing is vendors are not going to just be able to send an email full of buzzwords to buyers and make a sale. There's going to be a lot more in-depth questions of, and vendors are going to need to answer how the vendor is going to make the jobs easier of the teachers and district administrators, because right now, what is there? I mean, Aaron, you have your story. It's not working, and everyone needs to do a better job to make everyone's job easier. Not just those in the schools, but also vendors will need to figure out how to make their job easier, so they're not just blasting school districts with sales buzzwords.
Rose.
So I've got 3 Ps. So the first is, and I've already used this one, but there's going to be really significant proactive move towards standards and towards interoperability. And I mean, that's a whole separate conversation about where that will end up in terms of standards frameworks, but at least we have some rather than none. So we can be happy about that. And the goal of that is, as very much what Sarah said, is around, access, simplicity, and increasing instructional and learning time. We're just yet to quantify the staggering learning loss that children in this country and beyond have experienced. The second is privacy. I do think that there's going to be even greater focus on this, and obviously this particular area, I think it's something that's got more and more important, but relates very much to the data, who owns it, where it lives, and what practices are and how standardized they are in terms of the archiving, the return, etc., of all of that data. And that, the 10 questions for EdTech vendors unicorn documents cover this well. But if you keep putting off that privacy meeting because you're like, there's a much more pressing sales need, stop doing that. Have it. And then the third P, which is related to the other two, is parents. I mentioned it earlier, but the role of parents, I have kids too. I mean, we all have the 28 passwords and usernames. We have a new real stakeholder in the B2B and B2G ecosystem. And I think that stakeholder is going to get louder, and we need to be ahead of that as well.
John, bring us home.
Being on the ground with some of the vendors and some of the districts, I think what the districts are going to be looking for is vendors that are more agile to do optional integrations. So, for example, any way you can reduce administrative overhead at a district that isn't required by the state, but again, optional, is huge. So, for example, in Wisconsin, we've stood up an immunization API so that we connect to our state health organizations. So a CIS vendor that elects to do the work can pull back vaccination information that saves massive amounts of time for school nurses and could eventually benefit districts once there's a COVID vaccine for K-12 age students. But again, it's optional. So a vendor doesn't have to do that work if they choose not to. So I think that's really where I see, and that's an example during COVID time that's important. There are other integrations that we're doing that are important too. So yeah.
I love that. I mean, I think it goes to Sarah's point, right? You got to get beyond the buzzwords and you got to get to what is the value add and what is going to distinguish you as a supplier to your buyers, and whether that's doing that optional work for that vaccine information or making another move that makes somebody's job easier on the ground. That's what's going to get you that sale. So we're going to move now to audience Q&A. Before we do that, I just wanted to advocate to folks on this call, if you haven't yet signed the EdTech Vendor Pledge, please take that first step today. Sign the Project Unicorn EdTech Vendor Pledge. There are an enormous amount of resources that we at Project Unicorn can provide you, from scholarships to attend technical events to a referral to the right person, to frankly, RFPs that are going to be asking, have you signed this pledge? We want to be here for the EdTech vendor community and provide the programming that you need and that works for you. And so please take that first step today and sign the vendor pledge. We're going to move now to the Q&A. Brendan asked this question midway through in the chat. We're going to kick off with his question. Anybody else, please add those to the chat. But can the panel talk a little bit about the importance of interoperability between vendors of a district, in addition to interoperability directly with that district? Many vendors experience roadblocks put in place, either technological or financial, between systems of record and other tools that need rostering data. And so vendors are making claims of interoperability and open standards use, but maybe there's a technological or financial barrier here. So folks charging for access to interoperable data between vendors is a good example, I think, of a behavior we're seeing. Philip, you want to jump in? And
yeah, I think when LEAs craft that RFP, I think they have to be very specific to make sure that these vendors communicate well. I mean, often we do find LEAs or SIIAs that have, one vendor providing the SIS, another vendor an assessment system, another vendor an LMS. And it's absolutely crucial that these vendors talk to one another and also share, early releases of an API client or whatnot. But again, I always come back to this open communication. The stage has to be set by the customer, and that is the LEA. The LEA has to demand that this open conversation has to take place between EdTech vendors. And I found in some communities, like the EdFi community, for example, I work with a lot of different EdTech vendors more often shoulder to shoulder than not. And that's when some of these communities are very, very helpful for LEAs to tap into. but it's absolutely crucial that LEAs, SEAs in their RFP make that very explicit, and then also during a kickoff meeting, make sure that these channels of communications are open and the vendors do not put up any roadblocks to stop that interoperability between different source systems.
Anyone else want to add something there? 2 other questions in the chat.
I just add, I mean, Philip's spot on. I mean, obviously outside of the context of more formal RFPs, right? That's where so much of the, transacting is going on. So I do think that, especially smaller EdTech companies, they'll need, you'll need to ask the district or your contact person there if they can help broker a conversation with, whatever other partner or partners that there is a vision around making more connected, more integrated, more interoperable, because smaller vendors are not going to have those relationships necessarily. The other thing is that the standards organizations do have boards, and those boards are made up of people from multiple companies. You can try and see if you can have someone from your company join the board and become more knowledgeable and build more of a sense of an ecosystem, or tap into those board members who don't just represent their company, but represent the standards work moving forward, and reach out in that way. So I think it is about building some of those relationships and understanding it's about serving the customers and ultimately, educators and kids getting access, rather than being a competitive issue. You will actually be more competitive by being more collaborative.
So cooperation, right? So Sarah, you mentioned that those email blasts aren't going to work anymore in that sales cycle. I'd love to hear from you and from John how to get past the email blast to a conversation on the value add and interoperability that a vendor might bring to the table. How do they break through?
There's a lot smarter people that have worked in sales for years that probably have better answers on this. But I've seen some of the sales emails, and I think we've all heard, if you've been on any webinar that mentions sales, we've all heard about the schools complaining about right after the switch to distance learning started, they were just bombarded with just all sorts of sales from everyone that didn't necessarily fit the district. And I think some of the advice that I have heard from experienced, smart salespeople is to learn about the district before you send that email and figure out what they are doing, figure out what their student population is, figure out if your product would actually fit, and then start there, and then maybe you can break through or build your relationships or find a really good salesperson that already has a relationship with that district. But like I said, there's some really smart salespeople. I've seen a few actually on this call that could probably provide better answers than me.
Maybe we'll make that another webinar for.
I think that would be great. I think let's have some really smart salespeople on.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
John, anything breaking through, getting through the noise? There's a lot of noise out there.
I'd say the big thing is, just keep in mind that the districts talk to each other, right? These are smart people. And if you stick to a core that you're working for the students and you're working for the district, when you're thinking interoperable solutions, the cream's going to rise to the top. You can have the best sales team in the world, but if you are doing marginal work and not embracing interoperability, the companies that are going to thrive are going to be those that are, adopting that and doing what's right, again, by the students in the district.
Great. And I know we didn't get to our last 2 questions, but we'll go ahead and pull those to presenters and have them get some written responses. But you can also reach out to them directly. So want to end this with just gratitude and thankfulness to this blessing of unicorns that's joined me this afternoon. You can reach out to any of us via Twitter, via email. And really reach out to Project Unicorn and SIIA. We are here to help you. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, be well. If you're on the East Coast, stay warm. Have a great day.
Thank you.